During the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln used abolition of slavery as a motive for the Union. He thought it was a morally correct path. After the Union's victory at Antietam, Lincoln attempted to free the slaves with an Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation, Lincoln wrote, declared, quote, "All slaves in the rebellious states shall be thenceforth and forever free." This didn't apply to the border states. Lincoln went past the legal powers of the presidency and exploited his wartime power as commander-in-chief by creating this important document. It turned a war trying to preserve the Union into a war for African American freedom. A few years before this, 3 slaves escaped the Confederates and Lincoln would not return them to their owner. He called them a contraband of war. Congress ended up passing a Confiscation Act in 1861, stating that all slaves working for the Confederates would be considered contraband. A year later, 2 acts were passed by Congress, one being the Confiscation Act that declared slaves who engaged in the rebellion would become free, and an Militia Act that allowed President Lincoln to use freed slaves in the Army as he saw fit. Finally, slaves could be in the Army to fight for their cause.
With all these free slaves, over 1,000 volunteered to join the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. This was the first ever African American regiment for the Union. The free blacks came from states like New York, Ohio, and Indiana to join. The others came from slave states in the Caribbean. They were led by Robert Gould Shaw. Shaw wanted equality among blacks and whites. He led them into battle at Fort Wagner and was in front of his soldiers. This was unusual because officers are normally behind their soldiers. At Fort Wagner, he brought 600 of his troops over the fort's walls to be outgunned by 1,700 Confederate soldiers inside. They all were either killed, captured, or wounded. After this massacre of Shaw's troops and himself, the South greatly insulted the North by burying Shaw's body with blacks. They made fun of him and all of the North. Several soldiers won the Medal of Honor for their bravery, one of them being William Carney. Carney grew up in slavery and was in it for a long time. His dad luckily escaped his bondage and saved enough money to free his family. When William Carney became free, he decided to join the 54th Regiment. During his service, his regiment was sent to attack Fort Wagner. He was close to Robert Shaw into the front when all of a sudden they were pinned down by the enemy. Carney saw the flag bearer begin to fall, so he ran over to keep the flag off the ground. He carried those colors home even with a chest, arm, and leg wound. After this, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the highest military honor given.
Another important soldier was James Daniel Gardner. Gardner was an African-American soldier who was in Company 1 of the 36th Regiment. When his regiment was at the Battle of Chaffin's Farm, he saw a Confederate officer rallying his troops to move forward. Gardner ran in front of his friendly soldiers and shot and stabbed the Confederate soldier. His act of bravery awarded him the Medal of Honor. There was several other colored soldiers who won the Medal of Honor for their bravery and sacrifice. Lincoln wanted to take an extra measure for after the war to make sure slaves stayed free and lived better. So, Lincoln and the Republican Party did this by creating the 13th Amendment in the Constitution. The amendment passed by more than the required 2/3 majority vote. Also, Lincoln wanted freed slaves to get land for their service, so he ordered 20,000 acres of land from South Carolina to be sold cheaply to African Americans. The Secretary of Treasury, Salmon Chase, increased the land to 40 acres per family. General William T. Sherman also saved land in part of Georgia for slaves to buy too. Sherman was so nice he even agreed to loan settlers army mules. This is where the mildly known saying, 40 acres and a mule, came from.
Well, Father Jim and Father Latavius, what did you guys think about the Civil War?
Personally, I think the contribution of African Americans had a huge impact on the Civil War.
I couldn't agree more, Father Jim, but their contribution and ability to fight did not come immediately. At first, African Americans were not permitted to engage in the battle. but the Militia Act of 1862 granted them the right.
Outstanding point, Father Latavius. When they did participate in the army, they were still not treated equally. They were paid $7 to a white man's $10, and whites commonly had higher positions than them. In the southern states, they were forbidden from fighting, so they were commonly used as cooks, blacksmiths, fort builders, and spies.
You really know your history, Father Zephyr. This was a huge step for African Americans because this was the first time they fought in the American War.
Good point, Father Jim. The Confiscation Act was also tarnation in the war.
Watch your profanity, Father Latavius.
My apologies. So continuing. The first Confiscation Act passed on August 6, 1861. Authorized Union seizure of rebel property, and it stated that all slaves who fought with or worked for the Confederate military services were free to further obligations to their masters. And the second Confiscation Act, passed July 17, 1862, was virtually an Emancipation Proclamation. It said that slaves of civilian and military Confederate officials shall be forever free, but it was enforceable only in areas of the South occupied by the Union Army.
In the Civil War, there were several African American Medal of Honor recipients. My personal favorite being John H. Lawson.
Father Jim, wasn't that the man who...
Let me stop you right there.
I remember like it was yesterday. When Lawson was fighting for the U.S. Navy on a ship, a shell blew up, injuring and killing most of the crew. Lawson kept fighting even with a significant leg injury from the shell. What an event.
Wow, that was delightful, Father Jim. John H. Lawson was awarded the Medal of Honor due to his performance in the Battle of Mobile Bay, which you displayed to us.
Personally, my favorite Medal of Honor recipient was William Carney.
Why was that, Father Zephyr?
Well, since he was in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first regiment with black soldiers, he was one of the first African Americans to fight in the war. Also, his performance at Fort Wagner was incredibly patriotic.
Father Zephyr, that was outstanding.
My pleasure, Father Jim.
Speaking of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, are you familiar with Robert Goldshaw?
Why, of course, Father Latavius. He was the commander of the regiment. He led them in several victorious battles.
To conclude, African Americans played a major role in fighting in the fighting portion of the war, as well as the behind-the-scenes work. John H. Lawson and William Carney received the Medal of Honor for their performance in the Civil War, and Colonel Shaw led an infantry of African Americans into battle.
Father Jim, Father Zephyr, today's talk was incredible. Shall we?
Yes.
Well, fathers, we had a good discussion today.
Couldn't agree more.
Oh no, it's the brothers of the American Revolution.
Well. Isn't it the fathers of the Civil War?
Isn't it past your bedtime?
Yeah, who's your daddy?
I've had enough of you brothers. Let's end this once and for all.
Father Latavius, where did you get a lightsaber?
I don't know. Now before we start this fight, let's go over some basic ground rules here. No touching of the beard or face.
Well, of course.
And that's it.
Let's fight!
No.
No! Oh crap! You guys all okay?
Yeah.
Oh no, Father Latavius!
Father Latavius!
No! We will avenge him.